Okay. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us in today's event. So again, I'd like to welcome everyone to this afternoon's book talk with Dr. Carlos M. Piocos III on his recently published book for the Routledge Contemporary Southeast Asian series, Affect, Narratives, and Politics of Southeast Asian Migration. So today's event is hosted, sorry. Today's event is hosted by the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub of De La Salle University. So I'm Harmony Guevara from the Department of Literature, and I will be your host and moderator for this afternoon's talk. So I hope that you're all safe and well as we listen to our speaker and invited guests who will later share the responses to the critical work. Okay. So to provide us with the opening remarks, I would like to introduce Dr. Jasmine B. Liana, Professor of Literature and Performance Studies at the Department of Literature and Founding Fellow of Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub of De La Salle University. So good afternoon, Dr. Liana.
Thank you, Harmony. Good afternoon, friends and guests. And my greetings to the author we are honoring today, Dr. Carlos Piocos III. To the Director of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, Dr. Fernando Santiago Jr., and Center Fellows who are present, and those who have come today to listen to Dr. Piocos and the panel. I have the privilege of welcoming you and opening this event. When Kaloy asked me, I could not refuse. I felt it is my humble share in the work of the center, which has been increasingly vibrant and exciting since its recent establishment, thanks to the leadership and hard work of Dr. Fernie Santiago and the Center Fellows. The book launching today is another dream turning into reality, that Search will be a hub for cultural production and scholarship on Southeast Asia, evident in the form of discussions in various formats and the celebration of actual solid work in the form of creative outputs as well as publications. So thank you, Kaloy, for this gift and congratulations. The book, Affect, Narratives and Politics of Southeast Asian Migration, is an important contribution not only to migration studies, which is the broad field in which the work may be located, but to the effective turn in migration studies more specifically. It promises to be, from the first chapter that I read, it promises to be an instructive read on how Filipina and Indonesian women migrants are affected by the globalization of so-called intimate care or care and domestic labor, but how they affect the discourses about them and the very structures that both enable and disempower them. The deployment of affect as critical lens to investigate the Southeast Asian women migrants' experiences using a combination of close reading of their cultural productions and ethnography will potentially inflect the understanding of affect itself, and with it, the role of emotions in the sticky business of constituting experiences of transnational mobility and its attendant or consequent oppressions. I am excited about the prospects of this book's contribution. Dr. Carlos Piocos III, we are very proud of you. Good afternoon, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the program.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Liana, for your warm introduction to today's talk. And I think we are more than ready for this afternoon's discussion. So I would like to inform our audience who are joining us through the pre-registered Zoom meeting that if you have any questions while Dr. Piocos is giving his talk, feel free to type them in the chat box and send them to our hosts. So later, during our question and answer portion, we will try to address all of the questions raised. Now, if any member of the audience wishes to raise a question verbally, Kindly use the raise hand feature of our Zoom meeting, and we will turn on your audio so that you can share your question. So before I give the floor to the author and the speaker, I would like to provide a short introduction about the author. So Carlos M. Piocos III is a professor of literature and cultural studies at De La Salle University. His research interests include critical theory, cultural studies, Southeast Asian studies, and migration and diaspora studies. He has published widely on gender and transnationalism in international peer-reviewed journals like Feminist Media Studies, International Journal for Human Rights in Healthcare, sorry, Social Science Review, Asia Pacific Social Science Review, Critica Cultura, Humanities de Liman, and Plaridel. He has also edited and translated from Bahasa Indonesia to Filipino an anthology of Indonesian migrant women's fiction, Bantay sa Lakay sa Loob ng Aking Bahay, published by Sentro ng Wikang Filipino in 2020. As a poet in Filipino, he has released two poetry collections, Corpus, published by the UST back in 2010, and Kung Ang Siyudad Ay Pag-ibig, published by the University of Philippines Press back in 2019. He earned his PhD degree in comparative literature at the University of Hong Kong and his MA degree in critical and cultural theory at Cardiff University in the United Kingdom, where he was a Ford Foundation International Fellow from 2009 to 2011. So, good afternoon, Dr. Piocos.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Harmony. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I would also like to thank Dr. Fernando Santiago Jr., Director of the De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, DLSU Search, and Professor Jeremiah Joven Joaquin, Senior Fellow of DLSU Search, for helping me set up today's event. I am grateful to Routledge, especially their representatives who are in attendance today, Dorothea Schaefter, Senior Editor of Asian Series of Routledge, and Simon Bates, Editor of Routledge. Many thanks to Professor Jasmine Liana, Founding Fellow of Search, for the opening remarks, to Dean Roderick Nuncio of the LSU's College of Liberal Arts for gracing this book talk, to my friends Dr. Jeremy Chavez from the Department of English of Macau University, and Dr. Ron Bridget Villog from International Studies Department of the LSU for agreeing to serve as my interlocutors for today, and everyone who came in to join us into this conversation over Zoom, or who are watching or going to watch this streaming on the Facebook page of the LSU Search. I'm going to just So, the book Affect, uh, Narratives and Politics of Southeast Asian Migration originated from my doctoral thesis at the University of Hong Kong back in 2016. But as the case with all dissertations that get to be converted into a book, this monograph drastically changed throughout its 5-year incubation period. I think only less than 20% of the thesis has been retained here in the book that we are launching today. I started tinkering with the revisions, changing some sections of one chapter here, or restructuring the order of another chapter as soon as my book proposal was approved by Routledge at the start of 2019. I was hoping to follow this track until the end of that year, which is the deadline set to me originally by my publisher. However, the global pandemic, enforced lockdown, and isolation has forced me to look long and hard at the version of the manuscript that I had back then and convince myself that the best way to distract myself out of those despairing moments, which continues until now, is to commit to rewriting the whole typescript from the ground up. In many ways, I found myself writing both about the state of the global economy of human mobilities that were disrupted completely by our present global public health crisis, but also in a way commenting on the enduring structures of global inequalities inherent in the movement of, and labor of bodies, particularly those from women of global south. And these were all the more highlighted by all the changes and ruptures brought about by the pandemic. This COVID-19 outbreak has only revealed the limits of an intensive migrant labor-dependent economy in the region, the gendered inequalities of care provision and labor across the world, and the many ways migrant women from the global south are made precarious and vulnerable, both in public and private spheres of international migration. At the same time, the narratives that emerge from many Filipina and Indonesian migrants that I encounter in social media during these trying times are also not just about survival, but also about care, reciprocity, and solidarity along the lines of shared struggles put into high relief by this pandemic. I found myself frantically rewriting each of the chapters, taking in new materials and incorporating new dimensions that I have not previously explored in the earlier iteration of this monograph, not only to refine but also to complicate and enrich the arguments and the vision I had earlier for the book. The the title, Affect Narratives and Politics of Southeast Asian Migration, is pretty much straightforward. It delineates what the book is about and what it aims to do, which is to pull together and also unpack the force of emotions, stories, and discourses that intersect into and circulate among the bodies of Southeast Asian migrant women in their border crossing ventures across the region. Because of this, the book intervenes into the critical conversations on affect, studies, and scholarship of women's work and migration in Southeast Asia. Here, I argue that there is a growing corpus of cultural production of literary writings, visual narratives, and other cultural texts of Filipina and Indonesian domestic workers in Hong Kong and Singapore that needs to be included in the study of globalization and gendered migration. And two, these narratives reveal interesting insights on how migrant women are affected, but also in turn affect the existing structures of migration industry in Southeast Asia. So, at the heart of this book is an archival project of the emerging cultural narratives by and about Filipina and Indonesian women abroad, and an analysis of these texts not just within their usual designation as ethnographic data, but as active interventions into how they make sense of their identity, place, and position as migrant women. I discuss this by studying how emotions connected to belonging and displacement, shame and desire, vulnerability and resistance, sacrifice and grief are connected to discourses of social exclusion, victimhood, development, and nation building embedded in the global industry of household and care labor. In my first chapter, At Home and Unhomeliness, I talk about the field of transnational domestic work as structures of feeling where Filipina and Indonesian migrant women are welcomed and accommodated, yet relegated as guest workers inside foreign homes. By looking at the politics of hospitality, this chapter examines how the film set in Singapore and Hong Kong, Anthony Chan's Iloilo, and Oliver Chan's Still Human, problematize the inherent contradictions of social exclusion in intimate women's work inside the private spheres of their foreign employers' households in these host countries. I then analyze cultural texts written and produced by Indonesian and Filipina migrant women. The first one is a short story by Susi Utomo, Penjaja de Rumaku, or Intruder at Home, and Saiza Cruzbacani's photographs in We Are Like Air. These narratives present nuanced counter-narratives to the aforementioned films in portraying migrant workers' perspectives on their simultaneous inclusion and exclusion in foreign households. Here I argue Here I argue that these four literary and visual texts not only contribute to the ongoing discussion of on the limits of hospitality and the problems of social exclusion, but also opens up new imaginaries of belonging by representing the many ways intimacy and intimate labor transforms the discourses of openness and cosmopolitanism of Hong Kong and Singapore. In my second chapter, Shame and Desire, extends the discussion of intimacy by examining narratives that portray migrant women's sexuality as they navigate the moral and gendered ideologies at home and abroad. This chapter talks about how shame and desire operate as affects of Southeast Asian women's migration by analyzing literary and cinematic works that narrate stories about pursuing interracial romance and queer love, participating in sex work, and expressing sexuality as forms of belonging in foreign shores, from Indonesian domestic workers fiction such as Erfa Handayani's Supir Taxi or Taxi Driver, Maria Bonyok's Cinta Mura di Bukit Mera or Cheap Love at Bukit Mera, Tiwi's Sebuah Surat di Penghujung Abril or A Letter at the End of April, and Joanna's Kerudung Turkey or Turkish Veil, and Susana Nisa's Tuan Ako Pulang or Allah I'm Home. And then I cross-examined this to independent films like Patrick Daly and Joel Fendelman's Remittance, Ani Emma Susanti's Mengusahakan Cinta or Effort for Love, and Baby Ruth Villarama's Sunday Beauty Queen. By drawing insights from migrant women's own understanding of what counts as shame and shaming, this chapter argues that their stories present complex negotiations of their precarious position as they pursue love, desire, and romance as ways of exhibiting agency and mobility that go beyond traditional gender ideologies imposed upon them by both their home and host countries. In my third chapter, Vulnerability and Resistance, I talk about the themes of victimhood and agency in the literary writings of Indonesian domestic workers in Hong Kong and Singapore. These stories depict their vulnerability and the ways they negotiate and narrate their agency under duress. So I studied Tiwi's Sebuah Surat de Penghujung April or A Letter at the End of April, Arista Davis No Diamond and Diamond Hill, Indira Margareta's Cahaya Untuk Penaku or Light for My Pen, and Etik Huwita's Bukan Yem or Maybe Not Yem. The chapter examines portrayals of suffering that confound the issue of migrant victimhood by revealing how they find vulnerability as a resource for their agency. By looking at the tropes of patience, for example, these stories expose how Indonesian migrant women are not only made to feel personally responsible for their own suffering. However, the encounter of violence can also open new subjectivities from which they can derive power to narrate their experiences, subverting stereotypical depictions of pathetic and powerless victims of gendered migration, while also challenging paternalistic logic of women's protection of their home and host countries. My fourth chapter, Sacrifice and Heroism, unpacks ideas of sacrifice by studying how the nation state and cultural texts make use of its contending discourses to describe and prescribe overseas Filipino workers' stakes in transnational labor. While sacrifice is an important idiom that the Philippine state uses to support its tenuous nation building project dependent on its labor export policy, it is also crucial in how Filipino domestic workers come to a self-understanding of what their ventures abroad mean for them and for their families. This chapter illustrates how migrant Filipino women challenge and subvert the Philippine state's rhetoric of migrant sacrifice as social heroism by showing how independent overseas Filipino worker films or indie OFW films like Mes de Guzman's Balikbayan Box, Zig Madam Badulay's Bagahe, Patrick Daly and Joseph Fendelman's Remittance expose the contradictions of nation states' appropriation of the diasporic maternal sacrifice from suffering for the sake of one's family to sacrificing for the sake of homeland to sustain its labor export policy as a developmental strategy. By showing how the claims of Filipino migrant women for their own families are problematically attached to the Philippine state's goals of nation building, the films reveal the cruel entanglements that sacrifice constructs for Filipino subjects of labor migration while projecting imaginaries of subversion to this hero script of maternal self-renunciation. In my fifth chapter, Mourning and Movement, I track the political effects of grieving over migrants' death in understanding the affective dimension of labor migration, nationalism, and transnationalism, employing critical discussions on the political work of mourning to analyze two contemporary Southeast Asian novels that present different responses to death of a Filipina and an Indonesian domestic worker, Jose Dalisay's Soledad's sister, and Rida Fitria's Sebongka Tanaritak, or A Lump of Crackland. This chapter explores how grief becomes an effective economy of labor migration by reproducing and circulating feelings that forge a community to either foster or forestall political action. This critical reading maps out how grieving over migrant women's lives can lead to a more critical understanding of labor migration's policies and discourses in the Philippines and Indonesia, opening the possibilities of social activism that not only transforms national community but can also transcend national boundaries, especially among the ranks of Filipina and Indonesian migrants. In all of these chapters, I look at transnational connections between Indonesian and Filipino migrant women's stories and struggles, which has been predominantly framed within nationalist discourses, incipient in both the policies of Philippine and Indonesian governments and the rhetoric of migrant social advocacy. I believe that there is a radical promise in looking for these shared struggles and stories between Filipina and Indonesian women, even as the structures of global capital in migration industries are marking and marketing their gendered, racialized, and ethnic differences more and more. Which is why, in my conclusion, I discuss the complex terrain of organizing and social activism among Filipina and Indonesian domestic workers in Hong Kong and Singapore to show how emotions can mobilize them into solidarity and political action. I end the book by talking about the promise and limits of social media as platform for affecting public discourses on migrant women's issues and the prospect of transnational movement, intersectional advocacy and solidarities, and LGBTQ activism in effecting social change by looking at specific moments of and recent developments in grassroots organizing and political demonstrations among Filipina and Indonesian domestic workers in Hong Kong and Singapore. By portraying what and how Filipina and Indonesian domestic workers feel and how they act upon their feelings, this fiction and films confound what it means to feel at home and feel excluded, to find love and pursue freedom and security, to bear and endure precarious life conditions, to suffer for the sake of others, and to have a life that is grievable enough to matter to people back home. The stakes of these effective claims of Southeast Asian migrant women, written in print, rendered on screen, or embodied in the transcripts of their everyday lives, weave and sometimes rupture the politics that define and represent their lives and struggles. Through the critical practice of reading affect in the narratives of Southeast Asian migrant women, this book aims to illustrate how these stories compel novel ways of thinking about contemporary debates on gender, migration, and globalization in the hopes that such undertaking will close the gap between being affected and being moved to take action. Before I end my short talk, I would like to share my experience publishing with Routledge. I am very fortunate to have worked with dedicated editors like Dorothea and Alexandra Debro, who have been so generous in guiding this work into publication every step of the way. From the moment I submitted a book proposal, writing and rewriting stage, down to the submission and approval of the typescript. They have made the whole process smooth, and they extended consideration and understanding to authors like me who are working throughout these challenging times. It truly felt like a collaborative work with them and also a learning moment for me. I would also like to thank editors and marketing officers of Taylor and Francis Asia Pacific, represented by Simon Bates here with us today, for helping me with the promotion of this book. I would also encourage those who are working in the field of Southeast Asian studies to consider submitting to Routledge. You can visit their website, and Simon can perhaps talk about this later. Finally, I would like to state that the insights that I have gathered in this manuscript and the inspiration that has driven me to write about them came from my rich encounters and transformative immersion with the migrant communities who have adopted me in Central and Victoria Park in Hong Kong every Sunday when I was doing my PhD there for 4 years. The wonderful migrant women and men and their tireless advocacy and social justice work. So, shout out to Cynthia Abdonteles, Eni Lestari, Dolores Pelaez, Edwina Antonio, Aaron Seradoy, Ray Asis, Norman Caranay, Eman Villanueva, and Sheila Tebia, and to all members of Asia Pacific Mission for Migrants, Mission for Migrant Workers, Bitun House, International Migrant Alliance, Indonesian Migrant Workers Union, and Likha Cultural Collective. I would also like to thank John McGee of Transient Workers Count 2, and Jolo Van Wam, who used to be the Director of Humanitarian Office for Migration Economics, but is now doing important activist work in the island state, for giving me insight into their work of advancing migrant workers' rights in Singapore. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope this brief précis has perked your interest into this work. I am looking forward to your responses and questions about the book. Thank you, salamat, terima kasih.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Piocos, for your enlightening discussion. So I would now like to invite our two guest speakers for this afternoon who will share their responses to the critical work. So our first guest speaker is Dr. Ron Bridget T. Vlog, who is an associate professor of the International Studies Department of De La Salle University. Ron Richard Vlog obtained his PhD in International Development from the Graduate School of International Development of Nagoya University, Japan, through the Monbukagakusho Scholarship Program. He also holds an MA in Japanese Studies from the Ateneo de Manila University. Dr. Vlog has written research papers on the migration dynamics of Filipino workers in Japan. He has also conducted narrative research on Filipino Nikkei and factory workers in Aichi Prefecture. Also interested in labor policies, Dr. Vlog has been exploring the narratives of Filipino migrant workers from conflict zones, investigating the disconnect between migrant experiences and sending or hosting government protection schemes. Good afternoon, Dr. Vlog.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. All right. May I start? Okay. All right. First of all, I'd like to congratulate my colleague, research partner, and my good friend, Dr. Carlos Piocos, for completing this wonderful academic piece on labor migration. As a migration scholar, I know that this study is neither a conventional quantitative report on diaspora nor a qualitative description of the migration process. Kaloy's book is beyond that. It covers the emotional dimension of labor migration, the reasons why migrants smile, laugh, cry, grieve, sing, chant, curse, and engage in political contestations. The title of the book upholds its unique features. Kaloy weaves the affect, highlighting the emotions behind the migrant dynamics, the narratives, the stories, both in the realms of literary fiction and even lived experiences of Filipino and Indonesian migrants. And finally, the politics, the experience of negotiating with the powerful structures, the struggle of asserting their rights and their quest to establish a just relationship with their employers, co-ethnics, friends, romantic partners, family members, and relatives. All these, the affect, the narratives, and the politics, are equally important in creating a holistic picture of Asian migration. For me, the book offers a deeper context to the usually romanticized view of Bagong Bayani. Um, a Bagong Bayani is not only a hero, she is also a mother who loves both her children and even her client's son, a wife who feels the guilt of the guilt and pleasure of trans mothering. Sometimes she becomes a rival mother of her very own client. Um, Sometimes she's also a lesbian who simply needs acceptance and love. A photographer who desires to capture every meaningful moment of being an OFW, or an anxious caregiver, or an activist who fights for her dignity. So for me, the discourse of Bayani, again, of Bagong Bayani or heroism, places the migrants to the revered world rather than the realm of reality. Dr. Piocos provided an interesting concepts that really connects the migrant workers to the real world. He talks about malu or hiya or shame. Okay, he highlights those stories about domestic helpers doing sex work. There are stories about bad romance and the exciting awkward flirts and companionship. He even describes how shame affects migrant women's bodies, again, in the context of moral politics. The methodology is also very unique. Instead of numbers and text from officials and institutions, Dr. Piocos focused on visual narratives, the artistic portrayal of migrant dynamics. While critics might argue that some of these narratives are works of fiction, it is clear that the stories are actually inspired by the everyday political and social struggle of Filipino and Indonesian migrants in the context of the prevailing political environment. Thus, we can argue that these works are artistic expressions of crying for justice, appealing for humane treatment, or challenging the oppressive structures and powers in the host and home societies. The themes of the book, belonging and displacement, shame and desire, victimhood and resistance, sacrifice and grief, and uncover the affect that shape migrant consciousness and even inspires them to pursue activism. Clearly, the emotions are embedded within the nation's developmental strategies and the global politics of the labor diaspora. Again, as a researcher of migration policies, I can't help but ask, does the state really provide protection for our OFWs, given the fact that we have the Migrant Workers Act of 1995 RA 8042? To what extent can the state intervene in the personal affairs and even the emotions of the migrants? Perhaps the state cannot, but sound policies can provide relief and improve their well-being. And to what extent does the state's developmental agenda impact on the migrants' affect? True enough, we call them the Bagong Bayani, and the state continuously promotes them as modern-day heroes. But clearly, these narratives involve sacrifice, suffering, pain, heartaches, and grief. When will it end? I think not in the near future. Hence, the necessary interventions to provide or to improve their conditions. And indeed, this book contributes even to the policy discourse by providing a clear picture of the affective dimension. Both national and global agenda for migrants are concerned with the politics of well-being, okay, especially of the migrants. And the book reminds us that we can learn from the stories of Filipino and Indonesian migrants, and that they were victims of the past and they are still victims until the present time. And the women, as described in this book, are not merely powerless victims, but indeed, they exhibit agency that they make sense of their experiences and create or affect the discourses on labor migration. So some important lessons for a migration scholar like me, and I think Dr. Piocos highlighted this a while ago, Now, first is that the visual narratives need to be studied in the context or of structures of global migration. Also, intimacy in the private homes of the clients is an evidence of trust given to them, but also it endangers the migrants. Third, I think negotiations of precarity imposed by both home and host countries, should actually be examined. And fourth, grief as an effective economy fosters political action. We see the importance of transnational movements as essential political contestations. So, to conclude, Dr. Carlos Piocos was able to systematically organize the themes, giving the texts the power to steer emotions without undermining the theoretical grounding of the study. Finally, I'd like to perhaps ask Dr. Piocos about some of his ideas or insights or reflections regarding these matters. First is about in the intersection of the virtual narratives and text and the ethnographies. So, Dr. Piocos, maybe you can share some reflections regarding the intersection of the virtual narratives and text and the ethnographies that you were able to conduct. Or perhaps another way of putting this, as you complete this book, what are your thoughts in terms of reconciling the fiction and nonfiction, and also in terms of navigating these methods of research? Okay. And second, clearly, you also excluded mainstream films of OFWs, mainstream films on OFWs. What can you say about these mainstream films depicting the plights of OFWs? Perhaps you have some opinion about these creative works in terms of their affective components and their impact on the discourses of labor migration. And finally, I realized that the limits you mentioned about the limits of social media. You mentioned that there are limitations of social media in reproducing the narratives of OFWs. I was just thinking, with the advent of TikTok, Instagram stories, and other platforms, migrants have been, sharing their everyday lives, everyday experiences, their celebration, their bonding, their church work, etc. No? So how do you see these as potential platforms to, express their emotions and even to express their politics of affect? Again, thank you very much, everyone, and congratulations, Dr. Carlos Piocos.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Vlog. Okay, so maybe we can give Dr. Piocos a chance first to respond to Dr. Vlog's queries. So before we proceed with our second guest speaker.
Okay, I think you've really pointed out those questions really reveal some of the possible problem or limits of the book as well, because I think largely the reason why um, it's really important to look at these cultural narratives, because there seems to be a movement among especially among organized or Filipino Indonesian domestic workers who belong to a group or organization to start really actively producing narratives in forms of culture, in forms of literature, in forms of films. So and at the same time, these materials are in many ways, although they're fiction, they also are aestheticized and distilled narratives on the ground that they are very that they know very intimately. So I think that's the basic difference between looking at them as forms of fiction versus the non-fictive accounts of ethnography, ethnographic studies. But I think it's important to look at their intersection, because in many ways, a lot of these women, since they are writing their own stories, uh, in many ways, I think it's also important to look at the way they try to distill and organize their own experiences outside the hands of a researcher, if they're the ones who are actually publishing and writing. My comment on mainstream film is that the earlier version of the book is actually cross-examines mainstream OFW films like Anak, Floor Contemplation Story, and etc. etc. But I think, aside from the fact that there's so many film scholars who have talked about them already, who have talked about how they produce problematic representations sometimes on migrant women's role in, and how they sort of propagate it through mainstream films. I also think that it's also important to look at these independent films, uh, because they really put something. They really are trying to come up with new ways of looking at this. Kasi if we try to contextualize this, the history of OFW films has been here for about 2 decades already. There is an industry behind that, so it's interesting to look at people who are working outside those industries, the independent filmmakers, um, and the ways in which they create narratives, and sometimes they are fresher than the ones we have already seen in mainstream films in the Philippines. And finally, social media is a very complex terrain, especially since if you look at the kind of politics sometimes right now, um, with all of this fake news and all, and how even migrants, a lot of them, big chunk of them, buy into problematic narratives, especially in terms of domestic politics, in Philippine politics, for example. So it's I think I think it's a rich terrain to look into, and perhaps a new field to venture into, because it's in itself it's very complicated. Thank you very much, Ron, for that wonderful response.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Piocos, for your response to Dr. Vilag's questions. Okay, so let us now listen to the response of our second guest speaker, Dr. Jeremy Chavez. So Jeremy de Chavez joined the University of Macau in 2018 as an assistant professor of English. Prior to joining the University of Macau, he held teaching appointments at De La Salle University, Wilfrid Laurier University, and Queen's University. His work has found print in journals such as Critical Arts, Journal of the Midwestern Modern Language, or JMMLA, The Explicator, American Notes and Queries, or ANQ, Critica Cultura, Kemanusian, and Food, Culture, and Society. While his research and teaching areas are primarily in postcolonial studies, global Anglophone literature, and critical cultural theory, he is committed to being a strategic generalist with wide ranging interests across literary periods, genres, and cultural forms. Currently, Jeremy is working on a scholarly monograph entitled Positive Affects and Postcolonial Critique under Routledge, and on compiling and annotating a research guide on positive affects and on aesthetic theory, co-authored with Asha Varadharajan of Queen's University, which are included in the series Oxford Bibliographies in Literary and Critical Theory under Oxford University Press. So good afternoon, Dr. Chavez.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to begin first of all by kind of sort of rejecting the label as guest speaker. I am here as Kaloy's friend, first and foremost. Um, Unlike the previous speaker, Dr. Vlog, who is also a good friend, I don't have anything prepared. I do have, because I have only praise for Kaloy's book, and that's what I'll be sharing in the next couple of minutes, what I think the book does well and why it deserves praise. So first and foremost, congratulations, Kaloy, on your wonderful, wonderful book. And also congratulations to Routledge for securing this book, which will no doubt generate so much interest in the areas where it makes an intervention, in particular affect theory and migration studies specifically, but also cultural and critical theory more broadly. So as I mentioned, since I have, I won't be reading anything prepared, I will be speaking from the heart, which is kind of appropriate for a book on affect, I guess. So what I think the book does well is, one, it's in many ways very performative. By that I mean it manages to convince its reader or be persuasive, not just because of its intelligence, but because it's also able to marshal certain affects as you read it. You fall in love with the texts in the same way that the author clearly also is in love with them or are, yeah. And so that is, I think, one strength of the book is it's the power of its writing. And what is particularly impressive, I think, is it does this while at the same time not being reductive. One of the wonderful things that I think the book does is that it does not merely treat texts as kind of objects of analysis. Um, uh, Kaloy is able to bring together texts, not only ones that represent his subject matter, but also he finds the opportunity to include texts written by his subjects as well. So it includes representation and self-representation and putting them in a kind of stage confrontation. And what this does, I think, brilliantly is, as Kaloy himself would say in the book, is a refusal to simplify, right? Is to engage affect, and this is the word that the author uses in all its messiness. And then certainly one appreciates how he's able to navigate through all that messiness and still produce very convincing claims about the work that he looks at. I think since Dr. Vlog already talked about the intervention of this work in migration studies, I suppose what I can do is to talk about its particular strength and its contribution when it comes to affect theory. What particularly, I was taken by Kaloy's metaphor of affect as gelatinous. And he speaks about the qualities of affect in terms of its viscosity, which is kind of new, right? Affect theorists are very familiar, of course, with Ahmed's notion of affect as being sticky. Yet sometimes the degree of stickiness is rarely talked about. Affects are just assumed to be sticky because they are linked to notions of intentionality and so on. But what is interesting about Kaloy and what he adds to the conversation when it comes to affect theory is a vocabulary to talk about stickiness in varying degrees. He talks about it in terms of thickness and in terms of thinness, which I very much appreciate. And his book is just a masterclass on how to read thick affects that congeal, affects that are simultaneously at work in various contexts and situations, in various contact zones and so on. And so I think this is a particular strength of the book as well. If I were to ask a few questions, obviously I would ask the expected question that academics ask in conferences: what does this have to do about me? So I'd like to draw Kaloy maybe to my own area, which is positive affects. I'd like him to talk a little bit about positive affects and how that might figure in his work. I think it's pretty when he talks about shame and so on, there's a focus on the negative affects, but maybe he can say a little bit about the role that positive affects might play, whether as forms of cruel optimism or as an alternative resource of critique. I'd also want to ask Kaloy, and this is the obligatory question that people ask affect theorists, is how does he differentiate between affect, emotions, and feelings, especially when we talk about representation, whether or not it's self-representation or representation, because self-representation and representation undergoes what we might call in psychoanalysis a secondary revision, in that it is already a retelling of an experience that has already occurred and therefore might properly be more located in the domain of feelings rather than affects. So I suppose that's one question that I want to ask: how to differentiate between affects, emotions, and feelings, and why this particular instance, although Kaloy does offer a justification in the book, because you're more interested in how it circulates and how you want to talk about structures, right, rather than personal accounts. But maybe a bit more clarification on that will be helpful. But other than these little minor points, just a wonderful book that I am sure will be received and very well and will be very high regarded in the areas where it makes a positive intervention. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Maraming salamat sa inyong lahat at magandang hapon.
Okay, thank you, Dr. De Chavez. Okay, so I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Piocos to respond to those questions raised by Dr. De Chavez.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for that wonderful intervention on the important aspect of the book, which is its focus on affects. On positive affects, I I think positive affects is something that can be explored further because at least from how I understand it, I think positive affects are uh, are something that you can explore via ethnography and via the everyday, via observation, a longer observation with migrant women and longer interaction, because um, those positive affects sometimes emerges momentarily. For example, in the moment of encounter, even in some moments where it seems to be like uh, uh, framed within or dominated by negative affect, there is always moments of those little moments of positive affects. Perhaps in writing, you can see that this as a sort of all those silences and gaps that you can draw out from reading. And perhaps if you are somebody who's doing ethnography, you can perhaps observe and look at those moments in those encounter with them, in their narratives and how they talk about their stories. I remember always cherishing moments where I get to have encounters. For example, when I was in Hong Kong, every time I go back home, I would always, because I'm a cheapskate, I don't really buy seats in advance. I would always be seated at the middle of two other passengers, and most of the time they are OFWs, and they would talk and talk sometimes, and they would joke around their experiences. And I think in those moments, they would use humor to sort of also frame how they understand some of their experience as misadventures. So I think those moments of those ephemeral moments of positive affects could be explored from there. And yeah, the classic question of how to categorize affect, emotions, and feelings. I tried to, as you've noticed, I tried to sort of sidestep my way of addressing this categorization, because and at the last instance, since I'm able to write it and frame it, for example, within this affective themes of suffering or sacrifice or grief, they are already processed and framed as a feeling. Di ba? Feeling is the vocabulary or the naming of a particular emotion. Emotion is the understanding of affect. Affect is far more complex. Some other people would have very different notions of affect. But I think in the title. I'm using affect because I still want to draw from the terminology's openness and its complexity, and of course in many ways I'm just describing emotions, but I think the way I try to put connections and intersections of between these emotions, encounters, and understanding the way they understand why those emotions emerge is a way of effective reading. So I hope it sort of answers the question. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for that wonderful reflection on the book.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Piocos. Okay, so we now open the floor for any questions from the audience. So I would just like to reiterate the mini announcement that I gave out at the start. So if you would like to raise your question verbally, kindly use the raise hands feature in our Zoom meeting, or you can pose a question. Just type it in the I believe that there is a question and answer option then in your from your end. Okay, but if there are questions, now would be the best time to ask them. Okay, so there is one question here from an anonymous attendee. So, good afternoon, sir. You mentioned that your work might contribute to the globalization policy of migration, but how? In your book, which is based on, I don't know if there is an actual interview done with an OFW fictional narrative. What I mean is that you are suggesting from the perspective of imagination toward a real world issue and literally is not palatable to policymakers. I find your argument problematic for I'm sorry for it to try to raise the fictional, such as half truth, level of mass media as basis of decision that will run people's lives. How do you think how do you work this out, sir? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. I think this is an important dimension in the work that needs to be recognized. And I think it, in many ways, I don't really see fiction as something as half truth or untrue, or it doesn't have any point of comparison to reality. This is why also what I did with this book is that I try to intersect how I analyze fiction with some of the existing ethnographic studies already done by a lot of social scientists who've done work on both of these communities. So, um, because while I understand that, of course, policymakers will not read fiction to base their policies, but uh, I think an aspect of what I'm arguing here is that sometimes ethnographic data doesn't if ethnographic data doesn't and cannot go into the complexity of narratives, especially if those short stories are written by migrant women themselves. And all of the short stories that I've used here, they are actually written by Indonesian domestic workers in Bahasa, Indonesia. So uh and and a lot of these stories reflect what a lot of policymakers actually already know about the reality these women and the precariousness and their vulnerabilities. But I think the fiction provides the the effective dimensions of this fiction provides much more nuanced understanding on how those kinds of conditions shape their everyday lives, and sometimes in more private spaces wherein wherein a lot of these women won't share necessarily openly, even with a researcher and a scholar interviewing them. So yeah, I think I'm not saying that this is the only material that they need to consult, and what I'm saying that it adds into the conversation.
Okay, thank you very much for that response. Okay, so are there other questions? Uh, okay, so I know that I was asked by Kaloy not to have like a standby question, but I'll be honest. Since na-reveal na naman na this is like a conversation among friends, I'll be honest, I did find it a bit hard to compose a question, mainly because I was just really enlightened and I did learn a lot uh, from your book. Okay, so I guess my this isn't really more of a question, more of like I don't know, a sharing of sentiments. But I particularly enjoyed the third chapter. Mainly because I found one of the stories in the chapter, maybe not Yem, by Etik Juita. I don't know if I have pronounced the name right. I found it very intriguing, and you had I know, I hope this isn't like a super spoiler, but you had a key insight there, how the ending of the work reveals how agency is found, but without a name. And I really like how this made me see and did it did make me reflect on what you essentially did with the book, which is that you open new paths to agency. And I think that is yeah, we definitely need more of that. Okay, so there's a question. Okay, so it's not a question, but it's related to the book. When would this be available online?
We'll
Um,
talk about it a little bit later, right? Where they can find the book and where they can purchase the book.
okay. So, are there any other questions? Okay, so if there are none, okay, I guess that wraps up the question and answer portion of today's event. So now I'd like to give the floor to the publisher, Routledge, for a short message. Now, I would like to, I'm sorry, okay, here. Okay, I would like to introduce Mr. Simon Bates, the editor for Asian Southeast Asian Studies at Routledge. Okay, so good evening. Okay, good
Good
evening,
evening.
Mr. Bates.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to talk today. Thanks especially to Carlos and to De La Salle. Congratulations, Carlos, on the publication of your book. I'm sure it will be a great success. And I've just been asked to say a few words about how perhaps some of the rest of you listening to this might also want to write books for Routledge that will be great successes as well. So I'm just going to see. Oh, can I share my screen? Is that possible?
Okay, I'm going to make you a co-host.
That would be great. Thank you. I've just got a few slides I'd like to show if that's. It's easier to look at than my face, I think. Let me see. Oh, here we go. That's better. Right. And that should do it. And then I'm beginning. Okay, hopefully you can all see my first slide. That looks like that's working. Oh, and I've got a bar in the way for some reason. Okay, let me just try and, there we go. now I can actually see my own slides. Good. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about publishing a book with Routledge, what that involves and why you might want to do that. Just a brief introduction. So as you know, my name is Simon Bates. I'm an editor based in our Singapore office, and I work with authors who are based throughout Southeast Asia and Japan, China, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore itself as well. I do have a few authors in the Philippines, as well as in most of the other countries in the region you might care to mention, including Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore itself, of course, and Vietnam. And I publish primarily in areas relating to politics, sociology, history, and geography. I'm one of the more generalist editors in the Singapore office, so if you're not quite sure who to talk to, it's not a bad idea to send me an email, and if it's not a project for me, then I'm sure I can find the right person. I've put my email address here at the beginning, it's also at the end, and if anyone wants to get that after the session's over, Carlos has that as well. So just briefly, Routledge were founded in 1836 and bought by Taylor and Francis in 1998. So you'll see a lot of Taylor and Francis branding on our books as well. Our luminaries include Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, Jean-Paul Sartre, and many others. And alongside our science technology wing, CRC Press, we publish about 7,000 new books a year. So I believe that makes us the largest humanities and social science publisher in the world in terms of the number of titles that we publish. Why should you publish your book with Routledge? So if you're looking for scale, we have global reach, particularly in Asia, where we have an editorial presence in Singapore, but also in China, also in India, also in Australia, and sales representatives throughout Southeast Asia, including my colleague Jasmine Monaco, who I believe is on this call now, who's in Manila. We're widely recognized for the quality of our publications. We're usually ranked in sort of top 5, top 10 academic publishers whenever such rankings are published. We provide sort of personal guidance through the proposal and review process. You have a one-to-one relationship with your commissioning editor, whether that's me or one of my colleagues. And we kind of take you through that individually. And we have efficient production with high standards, which is to say we make books with good content that are also good physical books, and we do it fairly quickly. So the first thing you would want to do if you're going to try and publish a book with Routledge would be to put together a proposal. Most of this is fairly what you would expect. But just to go over the key elements that this proposal should include, and of course, we have guidelines that you can find on our website or that you can obtain by contacting the relevant commissioning editor. You should have a rationale. You should tell us and your prospective readers and reviewers why they should want to read this book, why it's important, what it's about, and why it matters. You should have a table of contents with abstracts outlining each chapter. You should be able to tell us a bit about related titles, that is to say, what other books exist in English with which this book will be in conversation, perhaps that builds on, perhaps that it disagrees with or challenges, or perhaps it takes a methodology from somewhere else and applies it to a new subject matter, and so on. Readership, who do you think your readers are? That is to say, what subjects, specialisms will they have? What interests will they have? What level of education will they have? Will they be postdoctorate? Will they be undergraduates? Will they be members of the general public? And sort of importantly, but less qualitatively, how long do you expect your book to be? We tend to think in terms of thousands of words rather than pages because they're a little bit more predictable. And how long do you think it's going to take you to write your book? How far away is it until you have a complete project? As well as your proposal, we also like to have some sample material if that's possible. And ideally, if you're, as I know Carlos was, adapting an existing work you've written, for instance, a PhD thesis, it's really good if you can have sample chapters which demonstrate that you understand kind of some of the changes that will be necessary in order to really make that previous work feel like a book in and of itself. And that's obviously something we often have detailed discussions with authors about, and we're happy to do. So what happens once you've submitted your proposal? I've actually missed a step here, because the first thing that happens is your editor will talk to you about it and may have suggestions for things that could be improved, other details we might need, possibly even things that could be shortened, and so on. And we'll make a preliminary decision as to whether we think we're interested. But assuming that that all goes smoothly, what we would then do is review the proposal externally. This usually takes us 2 to 3 months, where we will be sending the proposal and sample material to people we think will be kind of appropriately qualified to comment on the quality of the material, how interesting it is, whether they think there's an audience for it, and how large they think that audience is. I'm assuming primarily we're talking about research projects in this context, but if you were looking at publishing a textbook, we'd also be asking, how useful it would be for courses that they're teaching, whether they would recommend it, consider it a compulsory purchase, or just kind of mention it to students as something they might like, for instance. We would then share that feedback with you, and similarly to the way that journals work, you might be asked just to respond to those comments, to kind of provide a kind of a defense, or to tell us how you will take some of that feedback on board and make some changes. Or we might ask you to revise the proposal in the light of the feedback we've received, and then to resubmit it to us, and we would review it again, possibly with the same reviewers, quite likely with some new reviewers. So there's the sort of the relatively short route of just commenting on the feedback, and then there's the longer route of revise and resubmit, which is more appropriate if the feedback is kind of more critical in nature. Once we are convinced that the project is viable, your editor will then present it to the publishing committee or editorial board at Routledge, and we will discuss among ourselves whether this is a project that we agree we should pursue. So, assuming that we do agree that we should publish the book, we'll offer you a contract to publish, and we'll agree in that contract a delivery date. Usually that should be sometime within about 18 months of the contract being signed at the most. So that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about how far away your book project is as you propose it. Now, once that manuscript's been delivered to us, it should take about 5 to 6 months for us to produce the final book, both as an ebook and as a hardback from your manuscript. That's after it's gone through a process of copy editing, typesetting, and sending proofs to you to check, and so on, of course. So the combined total sort of amount of time that you sort of need to allow for from Routledge, if you're thinking about, well, how long will it take for my book that I'm thinking about writing to be published, is it takes somewhere between 7 to 10 months of us doing things for it to happen, over and above whatever time you're taking yourself. And kind of lastly, on the procedural side, the last thing to keep in mind is publishing the book is not the end of the process, as Carlos has been showing us today. It's very much the beginning of the next stage, which is promoting your work, because presumably you wrote a book because you wanted people to read it, and as much as Routledge are able to do to support with our infrastructure and our collaterals and all the rest of it, you will always be your book's best promoter, unless you have really good friends. So the more that you can do yourself to kind of spread the word about your book, whether that's through regular social media like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or whether that's through kind of academic professional social media like academia.edu or LinkedIn, that's tremendously valuable. If your institution is able to support book launch, that's fantastic. If you can identify people who'd be good to review and endorse the book, that's really useful as well. And sometimes there are other sales opportunities that come up, just to sort of perhaps provide a discount for the book, to make the book available to a select audience at a discount. On which note, My last slide. This is, and of course this will be, I'm sure this will be being shared outside of my presentation, so you don't need to record it now, but you will be able to, until the 13th of May, it will be possible to buy Affect Narratives and Politics of Southeast Asian Migration at a 30% discount using the discount code ANP30. That is the end of my presentation. I will be happy to take questions, but as I know things are time's getting on now, I'm also happy to take questions sort of offline via email as well. And my email address was of course at the beginning of the slides. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your time and thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Simon Bates. Okay, so if you have any questions with addressed to Mr. Bates, okay, you may raise them now, or if the question comes later, you can just send him an email. Okay, so again, thank you very much. Okay, so now let us move on to the closing for today's event. So I would like to invite Dr. Roderick Nunshaw, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts, for the closing remarks. So good afternoon, Dr. Nunshaw.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hi, good
Okay,
afternoon.
let me just open my cam. Okay. Kaloy's book, Affect, Narratives, and Politics of Southeast Asian Migration, is an excellent addition to the growing scholarship on migration studies written by and for Southeast Asians. The entire discourse of women's labor migration, which he has effectively and effectively discussed through his critical readings of the literary, narrative works of Filipina and Indonesian domestic helpers, and of documentary and full-length films depicting the personal, social, moral, political, and economic lives of our marginalized migrant OFWs, brings us back to the core problem of the many failures of nation states like the Philippines to pursue and to translate into concrete policies and actions towards social justice and equity, providing decent jobs, education, and sustainable development programs to its people. To some extent, a sense of familial semblance and close familiarity is present when we read news items or personal stories about the difficult working conditions, the harsh treatment of other people, and the uncertainties or anxieties of women migrant workers, because in a way, some of us may be silent about it or nonchalant to admit that we have sisters, mothers, aunties, and friends who are domestic workers, or if not, within our households, we have helpers or manangs or yayas attending to our domestic needs and chores. We also have stories to tell, advocacies we can initiate right on our doorsteps, and changes we can do to better the lives of the people around us and even those working abroad. Kaloy's book has made me realize the kind of epistemic and affective violence that the issues and problems of transnational labor migration and globalization have perennially troubled us. It is enlightening to note the study that rather the duty that we owe ourselves to do something about this is highlighted when he says with empathy and emphasis on page 178 of his book that, begin quote, by portraying what and how Filipina and Indonesian domestic workers feel and how they act upon their feelings, this fiction and films confound what it means to feel at home and feel excluded, to find love and pursue freedom and security, to bear and endure precarious life conditions, to suffer for the sake of others, and to have a life that is grievable enough to matter to people back home. End of quote. Malaki ang paghanga ko sa akademikong aktivismo ni Kaloy na kahit sa kasalukuyang kalagayan natin sa krisis na kinaharap nating lahat dito sa mundo at sa buong mundo, nananatiling matatag ang kanyang paninindigan na na gamitin ang kanyang talino excuse me, at kakayahan sa pagkatha, pagtula, pagsulat ng mga scholarly papel at mga aklat para isulong ang kapakanan ng mga kapos sa atin at silang mga ninanakawan ng karapatan at oportunidad. Binabati kita, Kaloy, sa kahanga mong kasipagan sa kaliwat ka ng produksyon ng mga aklat at maski mga journal article na naka-index sa Scopus para isulong ang iyong mga kaisipan at adhika. Naway magsilbing inspirasyon ka sa ibang scholar at mga mag-aaral ng sagayoy sa tulong mo at mga kasama nating kapanalig na mas lalo pang pag-ibayuhin ang produksyon ng kaalaman, sining, at iba pang uri ng pananaliksik ukol sa South Asian Studies, sa Humanidades at agham panlipunan, at higit sa lahat ang pagkilos natin tungo sa hinahangad nating panlipunang ginhawa at kaunlaran. Muli, isang mainit na pagbati sa iyo, Kaloy, at magandang gabi sa ating lahat.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nunshaw. Okay, so that ends today's event. Okay, so again, thank you to everyone who has joined us for this afternoon's book talk. Okay, I hope that you're all keeping safe and well, and we hope that you have a good evening. Okay, so goodbye, and again, thank you for being here.
Maraming salamat po sa lahat. Thank you very much.
Congratulations, Kaloy.
Thank you po, Ma'am Jazz.
Congrats,
Thank you, Dean
Kaloy.
Rod. Thank you,
Congratulations,
Jeremy.
Carlo, on the publication
Thank you,
of your book.
Dorothea.
It was great
Thanks,
working with you.
Simon. Thank you
Bye.
very much. Thanks, Ron.